They were beautiful boys, not men, not anymore. Dragged through the shadowed gates of Persepolis or smuggled past the gold-tipped domes of Baghdad, they arrived in silence, marked not by name but by absence. An absence of voice, of hair, of bloodline, of future. The court eunuchs of the Persian Empire were living contradictions, voiceless yet powerful, mutilated yet exalted, slaves yet closer to kings than their own sons. Their bodies told the story of an empire's paranoia and the unimaginable price of loyalty. History likes to forget them, but the stones remember. In the bas-reliefs of Darius's palace, soft-cheeked figures with folded hands and averted gazes stand just behind the throne. They are carved not as warriors or priests, but as shadows in silk. Herodotus whispers of them. 500 castrated boys sent each year from Babylon as tribute to the great king. This was not mercy. This was currency. Their beauty was their curse, their silence, their qualification. Castration was not just a punishment in ancient Persia. It was policy. Why would a king surround himself with mutilated men? Because a eunuch has no legacy, no wife to whisper secrets to, no sons to avenge him, no clan to divide loyalties. In the eyes of the Persian monarchs, this made them perfect. Eunuchs were living locks to royal vaults, keepers of secrets, watchers of women, instruments of control. They ran the Anderun, the secluded harem, and relayed messages between rulers. They carried the will of kings because they were designed never to become kings themselves. But history, as always, betrayed its own designs. One of these shadows rebelled. His name was Bagoas, a Persian eunuch who murdered kings and crowned puppets. In the court of Artaxerxes III, Bagoas became more than a servant. He was the hand behind the throne. When the king displeased him, Bagoas poured poison into his wine. When the prince resisted, Bagoas ended him too. This was no mere palace plot. It was the quiet rise of a man the world tried to erase. A man with no sons, no past, and absolute power. His story was recorded not by Persian scribes, who dared not speak it, but by Greek historians like Diodorus Siculus. They called him the most powerful man in Asia, but his name never became a dynasty. No mausoleum bore his likeness. He ruled but left nothing behind but fear. He was the Persian court's nightmare, the invisible servant who realized he was irreplaceable, the mutilated body that could still wield a knife, the trusted one who remembered how to betray. This paradox of dependence and disgust defined the eunuch's fate. They were kept near yet never embraced, pampered but never mourned. Their bodies were wrapped in silks, perfumed and oiled daily, transformed into beautiful ornaments of obedience. But their minds were something else. Those who were castrated before puberty never knew the shape of manhood. Their limbs grew long, their voices high, their faces smooth, trapped forever between child and adult. A eunuch was not a man, not a woman, and never quite human. That was the design. And yet the system depended on them. The kings of Achaemenid Persia, the shahs of the Sassanid court, even the caliphs of Baghdad, all gave eunuchs keys to the innermost chambers. The Anderun was off limits to most men, but not them. They guarded queens, princesses, and royal children. They dressed them, advised them, reported on them. The harem was both their kingdom and their cage. What the king could not see, they saw. What the king could not hear, they whispered back. But at what cost? The cost was identity. Stripped of their name, kin, and even the right to reproduce, these boys were indoctrinated into obedience. They were trained by older eunuchs in rituals of loyalty, bathed, powdered, groomed, taught that pain was their initiation and silence their weapon. They had no gods, no tribes, no afterlife to claim. All that remained was service. And behind the silk curtains of the palace, that service often meant spying, punishing, and sometimes killing, all while wearing the face of mercy. In this first chamber of history, we do not yet scream. We only listen. We stand behind the lattice screen of the harem, watching the quiet ones. We see a young boy, no older than 10, dressed in silk too heavy for his shoulders. He bows too low. He never meets your eyes. He is already learning. He is already forgetting. And in the breathless corridors of empire, his silence will echo louder than a war drum. They entered the palace as mutilated boys, silent, wide-eyed, and stripped of identity. But some of them, through skill, obedience, and sheer survival instinct, rose far beyond their roles as passive guardians. By the height of the Achaemenid and Sasanian courts, eunuchs had become indispensable. secretaries of state, keepers of royal schedules, arbiters of private affairs, and sometimes shadow rulers. This wasn't accidental. It was the outcome of centuries of institutional engineering that weaponized trauma, silence, and isolation. The courts of Darius I and Xerxes were the crucibles where this system matured. Eunuchs served as trusted liaisons between the king and his sprawling bureaucracy. With no lineage or tribal loyalties, they were seen as clean slates, tools sharpened for loyalty and discretion. They passed unseen through corridors others could not enter, bearing royal decrees and whispering intelligence from the harem to the throne room. Their value came from their visibility in the invisible, always present, never fully seen. But not all eunuchs were content to remain loyal servants. Power, once tasted, demanded more. Bagoas, the most infamous Persian eunuch, offers a chilling case. According to Diodorus Siculus, Bagoas wasn't merely a palace functionary, he was a puppet master. He poisoned King Artaxerxes III and every royal son save one, installing the weak Arses as a pawn. When Arses rebelled, Bagoas poisoned him too. He then tried to manipulate Darius III in the same way, only to be caught and forced to drink his own poison. This wasn't just political maneuvering. Bagoas exemplified how trauma, powerlessness, and strategic intelligence could combine into something terrifying. He had no army, no name that would survive him in dynasty, but he ruled more completely than many crowned men. His story haunted royal courts for generations. Even Alexander the Great reportedly had a Persian eunuch named Bagoas, though scholars debate whether this was the same man or simply the legacy of his name being used as a role title. Either way, the symbol endured, the beautiful shadow who pulled the strings. Yet for every Bagoas, there were thousands whose power remained invisible, but crucial. Their training began young. After castration, boys were stripped of their birth names and given new identities. They were relocated to the Anderun, the royal women's quarters, where they would spend their lives surrounded by silks, perfume, politics, and surveillance. They were dressed immaculately, oiled and perfumed daily, their bodies rendered soft and androgynous. Everything about them was designed to be pleasing, non-threatening, and utterly obedient. But behind this aesthetic lay a brutal system of indoctrination. The court eunuch was not merely shaped by pain. He was kept in a state of psychological suspension. Older eunuchs trained younger boys, often repeating the rituals of grooming with obsessive precision, mixing care with control. There was no escape, no family to return to, no children to outlive them. Their only chance of immortality was proximity to power, and so they learned to serve, flatter, and manipulate those who held it. Trust was survival, and betrayal, if calculated correctly, was promotion. Inside the harem, eunuchs operated as the final line of defense between the royal bloodline and the world. They guarded doors, intercepted letters, and often administered subtle poisons on behalf of their mistresses or masters. Their unique status allowed them to become confidants of both queens and kings. Sometimes this proximity turned lethal. Eunuchs could engineer marriages, ruin reputations, and quietly remove rivals. In many ways, the Anderun was a kingdom within a kingdom, and eunuchs were its ministers. Their power was real, but so was the fragility beneath it. A eunuch's influence could evaporate with the fall of a monarch. With no family or military faction to protect them, many fell into disgrace or execution. Some were flayed, others had their tongues cut out. One particularly horrific punishment reserved for traitorous eunuchs was the two boats, an execution method involving being trapped between boats, force-fed milk and honey, and left to rot alive as insects consumed the body. This wasn't just punishment, it was a warning written in screams. In the Islamic era, the Abbasids continued the Persian use of eunuchs but elevated it further. Despite Islamic prohibitions against castration, caliphs acquired eunuchs from outside Muslim territories, Africa, Byzantium, or Central Asia. In Baghdad's palace complexes, eunuchs commanded troops, tutored princes, and guarded harems. Their bodies may have been maimed, but their influence was vast. In many cases, they outlived sultans and caliphs, their silence a shield and their memory a threat. Their presence shows how power adapts, even within the boundaries of religious doctrine. The story of the Persian court eunuch is not simply one of tragedy. It's a story of how systems bend human flesh into tools, how identity can be stripped and reshaped, and how power doesn't always wear a crown. The eunuchs, nameless in most chronicles, faceless in most art, were the hands that held up empires. They remind us that history isn't just made by generals and kings, but by the forgotten ones who operated in shadows, who were both victims and architects of cruelty. They built empires with their silence. But when kings fell, eunuchs fell harder. Their power was always borrowed, never owned. And when a dynasty crumbled, they were the first to be purged. In Persia, Byzantium, and the Islamic caliphates, history repeated a vicious pattern. The same body once trusted to guard royal blood became a threat the moment that bloodline weakened. And so they were hunted, exposed, unmade. Their past power became their execution warrant. In the later Sasanian Empire, eunuchs had reached the height of their influence, managing embassies, orchestrating marriages, and keeping state secrets. But when Arab forces invaded in the 7th century, many of these palace men were captured or slaughtered alongside their royal masters. Chroniclers note that some tried to flee into the harems they once guarded, but there was no safe space left. Their genderless bodies, once their ticket to power, became a symbol of a fallen, decadent court. By the Abbasid period, eunuchs had become both mythic and monstrous in popular imagination. Poets and satirists portrayed them as whispering manipulators or tragic parodies of masculinity. In reality, their lives were more harrowing than either fiction suggested. Castration did not shield them from violence, it amplified it. Rebellious eunuchs were tortured with symbolic precision. Tongues cut out for spies, faces burned to erase beauty, genitals displayed as mock trophies despite their removal. Their bodies, once hidden and perfumed, became canvases for state cruelty. The case of Eunuch al-Khazari, a powerful eunuch in the Abbasid court under Caliph al-Mutawakkil, serves as a grim turning point. Once the commander of armies and a tutor to princes, Eunuch was summoned back to court under the guise of honor, only to be imprisoned, starved, and executed. His death was quiet but deliberate, a reminder that eunuchs were never truly safe. Their power was tolerated only when it served. The moment it stood independent, it became treason. Behind the marble walls of palaces, more disturbing practices festered. Some eunuchs, desperate to survive, turned against their own, reporting disobedience among fellow servants to curry favor. Others were forced to torture new recruits, breaking their spirits with the same rituals once used on them. In some courts, younger boys were kept in isolation for months after castration, visited only by veiled trainers who whispered commands and withheld names. The goal was not just obedience, it was erasure. These weren't simply systems of control, they were factories of forgetting. Eunuchs were discouraged from remembering their birth names, their homelands, their families. The state needed them blank, silent vessels to be filled with loyalty and command. In many cases, they were renamed after jewels, virtues, or abstract concepts: Safar, Amin, Kadim. No surnames, no lineages, no history, only function. When they died, they were often buried in unmarked graves outside palace walls. No sons to mourn them, no legacy to defend them. And yet traces of their rebellion survive. Secret court records mention eunuchs who hid letters, passed secrets to concubines, or quietly aided political prisoners. In the margins of history, they become ghosts, not just victims, but saboteurs. Their silence sometimes masked subversion, and their trauma sometimes birthed defiance. A Persian proverb from the Safavid period warns, "The mute shadow sees more than the king with 10 eyes." It was a warning not to trust the quiet, because in court politics, the quiet are often the most dangerous. In the end, the fall of the Persian court eunuch was not a single event, but a slow fade. Their roles diminished under modernizing empires. The Qajars, for example, still used eunuchs, but more as ceremonial figures than true power brokers. By the 19th century, Western influence in medical ethics brought formal castration practices to an end. But the trauma didn't vanish. Former eunuchs, those who had survived the system, often lived in poverty or exile, their histories erased, their stories untold. We remember empires by their rulers, their generals, their wars, rarely by the ones who cleaned the blood or carried the scrolls or locked the palace doors at night. The eunuchs of Persia were all of those and more. They were paradoxes, powerless but powerful, loyal but feared, mutilated yet made central to the machine of monarchy. Their fall wasn't loud. It didn't echo in revolts or riots. It ended in silence, the same silence they were trained to serve. History rarely mourns its functionaries, especially those who left no sons to write their names. The Persian eunuchs, once the whispering machinery behind emperors, slowly vanished from records and rituals alike. Their graves are forgotten, their portraits rarely painted, yet their legacy survives in the architecture of secrecy, In the blueprint of power, in the way courts still fear too much intimacy in too few hands. The body may have been erased, but the idea, the role, lingers like perfume in a sealed room. In the Islamic Golden Age, particularly under the Abbasids, some eunuchs penned poetry or secretly supported intellectuals and rebels, their silence giving way to subversion. One unnamed eunuch is rumored to have helped preserve banned manuscripts, hiding them within the walls of the Harem library. Another bribed a servant to rescue the son of a condemned noblewoman. These stories are not grand revolts, but quiet ruptures, acts of courage committed by the mutilated, the invisible. They weren't allowed to speak, but they remembered. Even as the political need for eunuchs faded, the psychological architecture they embodied did not. Kings, sultans, and modern tyrants continued to build systems that required loyal agents without roots. Operatives who would never challenge the throne because they had no tribe to return to. Whether literal eunuchs or ideological ones, the logic remained. Loyalty through isolation. Control through the erasure of identity. It was no longer castration with a blade, but with propaganda, uniforms, and internalized fear. Anderun, the Persian royal harem, no longer exists, but its echoes live on in gender segregation, in surveillance states, in elite inner circles guarded not by eunuchs, but by technology. But the principle remains unchanged. The closer you are to the source of power, the more expendable you become. Those who know the secrets are always the first to be buried by them. Eunuchs were trusted because they were believed to be safe, but the court never trusted them enough to let them live freely. There is an undeniable horror in what was done to them, and in what they were sometimes made to become. Torturers, spies, prisoners inside palaces. Many eunuchs spent their entire lives within one courtyard, never seeing a city street, never touching grass. They were perfumed but imprisoned, adorned but broken. Yet they often believed, or were forced to believe, that this was their divine purpose. Loyalty was not a virtue. It was a survival strategy. Modern readers may recoil at these histories, but they are not relics. They are reflections. Every authoritarian system still seeks servants who cannot betray, tools who cannot reproduce. The Persian eunuchs remind us that power often rewards obedience with extinction, and that systems built on silence are always haunted by those it tried to erase. In every palace echo, in every page missing a name, they remain unburied, unseen, and still dangerous.